Good afternoon, everyone. It's time to start, I think. Welcome to the 5th summer school webinar, if I'm correct. This is a webinar about iC3D suites. We are going to talk about advanced iC3D suite techniques and well, as all webinars in the summer school series, the idea is to have a little bit of a mix between theory and practice. There is a little bit more theory in this one because I want to talk about advanced techniques, and some of that stuff really requires some explanation before we go to the application and show some things there as well. As always, you can ask questions. There is in the GoToWebinar control panel an area where you can enter those. And as always, I will do my best not to look at them during the webinar, or I can't concentrate on what I'm saying, in which case my explanations will not be very good. So just enter your questions in the control panel, and I'll come back to them at the end of the webinar when I've covered everything. What's on the agenda for today? Well, that is actually 3 main topics. I'm not quite sure what kind of time we're going to do for this one. The goal is to stick to 1 hour. It might be a little bit shorter, we'll see. I want to talk about image-based lighting. That is probably the biggest subject because it's also theoretically the most difficult one. And I want to give you some background, I think, that will help by help in understanding what you can do with this in iC3D Suite. Then I want to talk a little bit about advanced materials. Not so complex a subject, but I want to show you some of the things you can do in there, both in the presentation and mainly in this case in the application itself. And then I also want to talk a little bit about labels and some techniques there. And this is something that we've covered in other webinars as well, I think, so I'm not going to dwell too long, but that is about labels and shrink and so on. And then there is one more thing. And even if you've seen the part about labels, I think the one more thing part is actually quite interesting. So you should certainly stick around and see what that is. Of course, I'm not going to tell you yet what that is. That's for the end of the webinar. Okay, so let's get started. The first item I want to talk about is something that we always use as a term in the marketing material for iC3D Suite, and that's image-based lighting. And if you look at my presentation, there is actually quite a bit of a strange slide in there. And if I start that, so that's Need for Speed. It's a game which is kind of interesting in an iC3D Suite presentation, but the reason I put that in there is because Need for Speed, as well as a number of other games, modern 3D games on the market, actually use image-based lighting. And the reason for that is that it has a combination of giving very accurate, realistic lighting on 3D objects, while at the same time it can be very quick, much quicker than trying to do lighting using traditional rendering, what is also sometimes called ray tracing and so on. And the technique is relatively simple, and the way it's implemented in iC3D Suite is really, really very straightforward. But it's good to understand what that technique does and to be able to use some of the consequences of that in iC3D Suite. Lighting is very, very important. And that's something that we find all the time. We know that there are some limits to what happens in iC3D Suite, just as there are limits to any similar technology out there in the market. We hope to remove some of those limits in an upcoming version later this year. But you should understand what image-based lighting can do, and that will make it possible to come a lot closer to realism than you might realize at first glance. Now, first of all, what is image-based lighting? And like I said, this is a bit of theory, and I apologize for that, but I think it's interesting to understand this. Typically in image-based lighting, what happens is that you capture a complete scene, the surroundings of, in that game, a car, or an iC3D suite, the 3D object that you're developing. The surroundings of that object are captured in a single image. And typically, it doesn't have to be, but typically it's in high dynamic range images. And so the image formats that are used are typically either JPEG, PNG, or HDR. And that HDR stands for a high dynamic range image. And a high dynamic range image, that is an image where you don't use, as traditionally is done, 8 bits per color component. If you have an RGB image, red, green, and blue are not caught or defined by 8 bits per color component, but they're defined by 16 bits per color component. And I see a question about slides. You should actually be seeing slides other than the introduction slide. I hope that that is the case. If you have an image like that, you can use that image to either represent the 3D environment of an object, or you can use that to use only the lighting component of that image. And that's what I want to give you a little bit more detail about. But before I go there, why would you want to do image-based lighting and not something else? Well, on the left-hand side, you have a quick imaging technique or lighting technique that is not using image-based lighting. And what you see is that you do have reflections of the lights in objects in the space. But those reflections of the lights don't contribute very much to the coloring of the objects that you have in that space. If you look on the right-hand side, those two glass spheres both have the reflection of the light that shines into them, but you can also see the effect of that reflection on those glass spheres on the rest of the space. So you get a much more realistic lighting environment. And this is why it is used inside of the in games like Need for Speed. This is also why it's a very good way of doing this in iC3D Suite, because the lighting that you see is quite accurate. Okay. The second thing you have to realize is that the kind of images that are being used here are flat images, but they really represent a 3D space. So it is as if you are standing inside of a bubble, inside of a sphere, and you want to capture everything that you see around you. It's a true 360 image in all directions around you. And that's also what you have in iC3D Suite. If you have an object in iC3D Suite, the effect that you have is that that object is really contained, stands inside, in the center of an environment map, that 3D representation, or the 2D picture representing a 3D space is a more accurate way of saying it. The way to do that, the way to capture images like that or create images like that, you actually have different formats. You have something called light probe, where a very reflective sphere is used and is actually photographed. So you have an actual physical sphere in a room somewhere, and that reflects the surroundings of that sphere, and you take photographs of that and then stitch that together. You have a spherical map that a number of even iPhone applications can create from you. There is a free tool from Google, if you search for that, as a free tool from Google that allows you to take a number of pictures with your iPhone, and then it will stitch them together. I'm looking very quickly at my iPhone, and I believe it's called Photosphere. And of course, the quality, if you do this with an iPhone, is not ideal, but the app will show you which pictures you take while you rotate in the room where you're in and tilt the iPhone up and down to capture every bit of that room. And then the application will stitch all of those pictures together to something that looks like that spherical map that you see in the middle. And then you have something that is much easier to create in, for example, Photoshop, and where you take a number of images, one for each side, actually, so one for the top, the bottom, and then the four walls, if you want, that you see around you. And then that is assembled together in what is called a cross map for obvious reasons. And you either have vertical or horizontal cross maps in there. So those are the different types of formats that you can use to capture such an environment map, and those are also supported by iC3D Suite. Now, there's a difference between environment maps and lighting maps, and it's an important one. On the left-hand side here, what you see is an environment map. This is one of those pictures. If I go back one slide, you can see it's a spherical map. It's the one we have in the center. So that's a spherical map that represents the inside of a building. And you can see that it actually it consists out of pictures. So you see the actual walls, you see cupboards, you see doors in there, whatever is in there is captured. You can see that there is also light in that image. And on the right-hand side at the bottom there, what you see is a lighting map. And a lighting map represents only those areas of the picture that actually give light in some way, either because they give light or because they reflected from the kind of material that is used in the image. And what iC3D Suite does is it can either use lighting maps or it can use environment maps. And if you load an environment map into iC3D Suite, it will calculate a lighting map from it automatically. That is also why this process takes so long. Importing an environment map inside of iC3D Suite takes, on average, about 30 minutes. It's a very long process for each environment map you want to import. But you only have to do this once. That lighting map is derived from it, and a bunch of other information is derived from it. And then afterwards, using the lighting information is really, really quick. That's real time, right? But that's what happens in iC3D Suite. It can use these environment maps or a light map, and it can create one from the other to make your life easy. So the only thing you have to do is actually specify the environment map that you want to use, and iC3D Suite will derive everything else from that. Now, you're not obligated to start by creating an environment map. So you don't have to take pictures and then derive the light information from there. If all you need is the light information, then you could just as well create an abstract image and use that. And you see two examples here. Again, one of those spherical maps on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you see a cross map. And I'll come back to that cross map in a second. But those are really environment maps. They're not light maps. They're not environment maps. They don't contain pictures. They only contain light information. And you can use that just as well. You can even make your own, and that's what I started to say about those cross maps. The cross maps are really, really easy to create yourself. What you do is, in Photoshop, you create an image that has 1024 by 1024 pixels for each square in that cross. And the cross contains 6 squares if you look closely. Right? You have one for the ceiling, and on the right-hand side you see kind of how that would be folded together to a box, and the object that gets lighted is in the middle, in the center of that box. So the top square that you have there is the one with that white circle on it. The floor, if you want, is the one with the black circle on it, and then the rest, if you fold this into a cube, will form the walls. So you simply create that picture inside of Photoshop. The dimensions will be 4 times 1024 vertically in this case, and then 3 times 1024 in the other direction. And I'm not going to try and calculate out of my head here what that is, but you can do that easily enough. But each square just needs to be 1024. And if you create it in Photoshop, every area of that image that you make black, that means that there is no light coming from that area in the image. So whatever you want to be dark in that light map, you make a black. If you want to have a very bright light in your light map, then you use white. And the different shades of gray you have in between represent all the different light intensities that you can have in real life as well. And of course, you're not limited to black and white. And I don't think I have a slide for that, but there was an example on the previous slide. This is an abstract light map, and instead of just using white as a light color, they also have a cyany and a greenish looking light in there. And that will do exactly what you expect. If you want to have a very warm yellow light environment, then you don't use white, but you use yellow to represent the lights in that light map. And I could do exactly the same thing, have black, and then instead of shades of white, I could have shades of yellow. And in that case, it will be yellow light that is thrown over the object that you have in iC3D Suite. So that works exactly the way you would think that works. So how can you use that theoretical information inside of iC3D Suite? Well, first of all, you can import your own lighting maps and environment maps. I already said that. It takes a long time to import them, but it's a one-time thing to do that, and then you can use them very, very quickly. You can place, of course, models inside of one of those environments, and you can choose in iC3D Suite whether you want to see the actual environment itself or whether you only want to use the light from that environment. Both are possible. So I can place an object inside of a store somewhere and see the actual store around it. Or I can say, no, I want the light conditions from the store, but I want a neutral background that doesn't take away from the view I have on the object. So both are possible. And this is something that I find not too many people know, and it's a pity because it's a very important part. You can actually move the lighting scene around the object. So if I create a teacup and I place that in my scene and I want to have a particular view on that teacup, then I can do that. I can place the object in a particular position. And then I can grab my light scene, and I'll show you in a second how to do that, and I can move that around. And that means that the lights that I have in that lighting environment will change position with regards to the object that they are lighting. And that can be used to throw the kind of deeper shadows that you need somewhere, or to highlight something that you want to highlight in the design by focusing a light on it. It's a very neat technique. It's very, very simple to do, and I'll show you exactly how to do that in a demo. So that leads us to the first demo of lighting environments in iC3D Suite. So let me minimize this for a second, actually hide the presentation. Now we need iC3D Suite. And when we're talking about lighting, well, actually, let me see if I have something that I could import here, and I'm going to take this one. This will take just a second to import. It's a file with some different elements and some detail in there that I created. So this is a jam jar, and you can see the lights playing across the glass as I rotate this object. So what I would want to do is have this and then have a lighting environment for that. And all of the lighting stuff in iC3D Suite is contained in a tab called Lighting. That makes sense, right? And what you have there is this little pop-up menu, and that contains all of the lighting environments that you have in iC3D Suite itself. When you install the application, there will be 3 or 4. Some of these abstract ones are in there. And then you can use the controls that you have here to import such a lighting environment. You can also export them if you want to see what that looks like. So I could go to this, the basic one, and then say save. And it's going to export a PNG file for me. So I'm just going to do that on the desktop. And now let's open that in preview. And what you see is that it actually exports one of those cross maps that I talked about. So each of these is 1024 by 1024. You have 6 of them representing the ceiling. I have to be careful what I say now. This is the ceiling, this is the floor, and then these 3 and the bottom one are the walls that you see, the side areas of that cube that you get when you fold it. So you can actually export them, and that also means that you could export one of the lighting environments that you have in here and then modify that to suit your needs. You can see immediately that when I go to one that has color in it, this abstract one with the cyan and the green color, I see those colors reflected on here immediately as well. And that's exactly what I was talking about by simply inserting colored light information in that light map. You actually have colored lights shining on your objects. Now I can choose, and that's the other thing that we discussed, I can choose to see either only the light itself playing over my object, but having a neutral background, and I can choose the colors of that background if I want. So I could make it more of a studio environment by double-clicking on top and then changing that to white or something like that. What I can also do is say, show me the environment map. And now I have something that is positioned inside of this environment. And if I rotate the object, I actually also rotate the lighting environment. So these are those colored areas that you have. And you can see that there is some reflection on the floor and so on. So you can choose to show an object inside of that environment, but of course that doesn't make much sense for these abstract environments unless you have a very wide studio environment perhaps. What makes more sense is that in that case I use a store environment, and then I can place objects inside that store. Now there is one thing I have not explained yet, and that is how the light from your model, the color of your model, and the light of your environment interact. And let me do this. What you can see now is that I have a really bright model in this store. The model looks much brighter than the actual store does. And the reason for that is that I designed all of the artwork for this model in Illustrator. They're very pure colors. There is a very nice RGB image with the strawberries on there. So all very bright colors in there. The textures have very bright colors in here as well. And when I set diffuse contribution to 100, so when I move that completely to the right-hand side of that slider, what that means is that I actually discard most of the effect that this environment will have on my object. You can see some of the reflections and the light plays on it, but the environment is much duller overall. The color tone is much duller than what is actually taken into account for the object. So this is an idealized, if you want, environment. You're looking at how this object would look in an ideal world when it's created with very vibrant RGB colors and really lighted with very vibrant color on it. If I go the other way and I set this to 0, you get a representation that is much, much more accurate. If I place this into this real shop environment with the dull lighting that you also see on these chocolate packages here, what you will see is very likely something that comes very close to this strawberry jar. Very dull, not very attractive actually. But that's caused not by the design, but by the lighting. And I can make a mix of those two. So I could say, let's do something that still looks good, but that actually is also gives me a more accurate representation of how this thing would look in that shop. And the trick, of course, when you're doing things like this, and if I really wanted to place this in the store, I would start by making it smaller, and then I probably would set it on a shelf somewhere. You could reposition that and put that on the shelf there and stuff like that. So the trick really will be to set this slider so that it doesn't pop out of the scene as you would see in a bad cartoon, but it also doesn't look as dull as something that is really, really unattractive. You would put it somewhere in the middle so that it still looks good, but it fits into the rest of the lighting that you have inside of that environment. So not only do you have the light in there, but you can also control how much that lighting environment will reflect on the colors that are used inside of your objects and the artwork that you have on your objects, your 3D objects. And then you have some contrast and brightness sliders to play with as well, but the most important one by far is this diffuse contribution. Now I'm going to set this back to color so that I don't see the environment information but only the light, and I'm going to go back to one of the, and actually I think the other one is probably better. I'm going to go back to this one. Now if I rotate this object, I can still see different light playing across it, but that's a little bit annoying. I mean, what I want to do is I want to position this somehow, and I want to say, for example, well, my customer wants to see this a little bit turned so that I see a little bit of the top, and then I do need to see the major part of the label. So I need the object to be like this, and now I need to take a high resolution image of it. And unfortunately, that means that I cannot rotate it, because once I rotate it, it no longer represents the object as the customer wants to see it. What I can do is I can press the S key, and I can't show you that I'm doing that, but I'm simply pressing the S key, S from Sarah, on the keyboard, and then I'm going to take the mouse, click on the background, and I'm going to simply drag that background. And as I move the mouse with the S key pressed, you can see that I'm actually rotating that lighting environment across the object. And I could look for something where, for example, this, where I have some more depth, nice red depth in the texture, but I still see the light playing on the glass of the jar nicely as well. And maybe I need to see if I move it down a little bit, it gets better. Or so you can really move the lighting environment around the object and look for a combination of lighting and shadow that is the best possible representation of your object. So once more, it's two things that you have to do. The first thing is I don't press anything on the keyboard. I simply me see if we can correct that. That should be better again in my experience. Okay, so the audio should be back now if everything is okay. Perfect. So that was what I wanted to show for the lighting stuff. And that means I need to go back to Keynote. And in Keynote, what we're going to do is go to the next slide. This was the biggest topic that I have. I think I have two smaller topics now that I want to spend 5 minutes each on, and then it's time for the +1 there as well. So the second thing is materials, and one of the questions we get is how can you get something to look more realistic? And what we see is that people more or less understand how materials work, but they almost never look at the more advanced material properties, and that's a shame because that is important. Now, this is kind of a summary of what you can do with materials inside of iC3D Suite. To each piece of a model, and in most 3D applications, that's called an independent mesh. To each piece of a model, you can assign its own material. And if you create your own models with the 2D spinner or with the shape modeler inside of iC3D Suite, then you can cut them up to make sure that you can assign different materials to different parts of the model. Where do these materials come from? Well, there is actually a quite extensive material library inside of iC3D Suite. And not just metal or paper, but you can really customize each of these properties of that material to a very high degree. The default library contains a number of presets. You can then duplicate them and adjust them, or you can create completely new ones with the material editor as well, and it will show you a preview and so on. You can also get materials by importing them in a 3D model. So if you've used another 3D application and exported, I don't know, a Collada file or a 3ds file or something like that, and you import that into iC3D Suite, then the application will also import all and maintain all of the materials in there. And I have a nice example of that in a second. And then you can store all of these things in a material library and then group them in there as well. And what is important, and again, this is something that not too many people realize, iC3D Suite is nice in the sense that it has floating licenses. And that means that if you have 3 designers, you can buy one floating license, and all 3 of those designers can work with that one license. Of course, not at the same time if it's a single user license, but they can all install the software, and at different points in time, they can all launch iC3D Suite and work with it, all with that single license. Now, the next question that I then get from people is, yes, but can we make sure that the work that we're doing is also shared? And iC3D Suite actually allows you to put the material library and the model library on a shared location somewhere. And that means that wherever you launch iC3D Suite, it will always launch with the same material library and with the same model library that lives on that common server. Okay, so what's the material editor? Well, that's what you're looking at in here. If I open up a material, either one that is assigned to a model or one that is in my library, this is what I get. And I'm not going to talk about holographic or lenticular today. Those are used to, so I am going to talk about it apparently. Those are used to simulate holographic effects and lenticular effects, but that's kind of a special separate topic. I am going to talk about properties and textures. Properties is the part that probably all of you know. It's the basic settings. I have a diffuse color, which is the color of the object itself. I have a specular color, which is really the color of that you get when you reflect light on it. So in this case, the white areas that you see here are light reflections. And if I would change the specular color to a greenish color, then I would get more greenish reflections from that object as well. So that's the two color components that you have in there. And then you have control over shininess, which is obvious, refraction, which is how much does this material refract the light that goes through it. You have transparency, which should also be relatively obvious. And then you have roughness and bump depth that you can use to create kind of a 3D feel to it. The bump depth here is used to create this paper, soft paper tissue-like view. Then the next part that you have is textures. And it's often overlooked, but you also have what is called diffuse map, shininess map, bump map, and transparency maps, and all of those are textures. And very often when you create something in a real 3D editor application and then you import it in here, you'll see that the special effects that they do for materials are actually coming from those texture maps that are added to the material. And in this case, there is a bump map. You can see this bump map with kind of like this lined, embossed, imprinted, however you want to call it, pattern in there. Well, that's the same pattern that you see on this actual sphere. So that bump map that you have here, together with, if I go back, the bump depth setting that you have in the properties settings, those two work together to create a 3D impression of the surface of that object. Okay, so let's go to iC3D Suite again and talk about materials for 5 minutes, I think. I said it was going to be short. I think I'm not going to make it that, but we'll see. So what you have in here is actually quite complex, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something new, and I'm going to import something from my model library. And this is a kumquat, which is a, as I heard this afternoon, a cute little fruit. And the kumquat is special because it has, well, you see it has a very rough outside skin. And if you don't have that roughness to it, it will look absolutely different and totally not the way it's supposed to look. Now, this was imported as a Collada file, and when it was imported, all of the textures were imported as well. You can see the different meshes I have here, the different parts of that object. And if I click on this one, for example, this is the fruit itself. And I can double click on that and open the material editor. You can see that the bump depth is quite significant here, 50. And let me switch that off. And you can see that this one now already makes changes. So if I change this, I get a very different looking fruit. What actually happens is that you're influencing how the bump map is supposed to be drawn on the model. Okay, so let's start by bump map, and then we'll go back to that slider and I'll explain in detail how that works. This here, it's not the one that is used here, but this is an example of a bump map. And what you're seeing here is pretty abstract, but you're seeing a mixture of different colors from bluish to reddish. And those actually are used to represent surface heights, if you want. So blue might be not very high at all, and red may be much higher from the surface. So this image represents variations in height from the surface, roughness, if you want. And what we've done here is we've added actually three maps in total. We added a diffuse map with the actual image itself. That's the color that you see of the kumquat. And the fact that it is more yellow on one part, and actually let me switch off these other two. That's much better. So the image that you see here for the diffuse map is just a JPEG or a PNG image, and it represents these spots that you see on the fruit. The fact that you have orange, you have some deeper orange, you have something that approaches yellow. So that only represents the appearance of the color, if you want, of the different parts of that kumquat. And then I can add a shininess map. And a shininess map tells the application or tells iC3D Suite how shiny different parts of this object are. And of course, I could also do that with the shininess slider, but if I do it with this slider, it is for the whole object. Every part of the object will be just as shiny if I use the slider. If I use a shininess map, I can use this black and white representation, and I have a much simpler one here. This could be a shininess map where black says not shiny at all and white says very, very shiny, so 100%. Of course, if I start using shades of gray again in here, as is done here, then I get that play of areas that are shiny, other areas that are not as shiny, and it helps to create again some depth in the object to make it look like a real fruit and not something that was created in metal. So that's the shininess map. Let me switch that off. I only have the diffuse map now, and now we're going to switch on the bump map. And the bump map, as I said, has those blue and red areas in there, and those are responsible for creating the areas that are bumped up and other areas that are more depressed. And now, because you have that, the light that falls on this fruit starts creating shadows caused by those bumps and valleys that you see in there. And the reason I can still work with this slider is because that allows me to influence how significant this is used. So the bump map introduces the variations between the tops and the valleys that I want. And the slider says how high the tops will be and how low the valleys will be. The more I go in this direction, the more of that I get. So now I get it as a maximum. And if I go to the other direction, it changes the interpretation of values and tops. So in one direction, blue in here might represent the tops, and the reds might represent the value, the valleys. If I switch bump depth to the other direction, then the red areas will be the tops and the blue will be the valleys. So those play together. Experiment with that. It's not that difficult to make these maps and experiment with that. For example, what I did here is what you can do is you can take something that should be it's a nice object, nice simple object, and now I can select one of the materials in there. So let's take the glass. Shininess, refraction, transparency, everything that I would expect for glass. And a very white reflection, hence a specular color that is white, and a quite green material, hence why I have this dark green in here. Now I can start playing with texture. I'm not going to go too far with this, but for example, I could use a transparency map. And for the transparency map, I can select that very simple one that I have here. Remember the one with stripes in it. And I simply open that, and that's going to give me something that's really weird. Okay. And what you see in here is that what you get is an object that's partly transparent, partly totally non-transparent. That's because I worked with black and white, and I didn't work with shades of gray in there. Okay, let me go back to I see the presentation actually. I'll see how it's done. Okay, so the last bit, and I wanted to mainly add this because it's something that we get lots of questions about on what the best way to do this is. But I'm not going to show too much for this. I've already done that a couple of times in older webinars, and those have been recorded. What I am going to do is I am going to go over the theory for that. The question that we get very, very much is how can we add information to objects? And the first thing that you think of is labels, actually. And what I wanted to highlight very briefly is that there are two ways to add information. One is using labels. And the advantage of labels is that labels can be double-sided. They can also be deformed in the special effects panel, and they can float over a model or over part of a model. And that all makes them very convenient. It's also very easy to create them. There is not much work to do it. You simply create a label and then you grab it and you float it over the model until it's in the spot where you want. And then you can add artwork with Illustrator or by selecting a PDF file in the PDF editor inside of iC3D Suite. So that's very simple. But you can also, and that's something that people very often forget, you can also add that same functionality using shrink. And the advantage of shrink is that it can be used on models where labels would be painful to apply. And then the artwork on it can also be added using Illustrator or the PDF editor and can be added simply to the shrink. And the artwork, if you use Illustrator, can then also be undistorted. And that's a very important part. Now, I'm going to just show something very, very quickly here. And that is in iC3D Suite. If I start a new object and I want the cup for that, if I add a label to this, let's make it long enough so that we see something. You can see this deformation that you get, and that's very, very difficult to get rid of. There is, under special effects, there is a way to select a label and say bend it, and then it will deform the label to fit this container. But it's a relatively inaccurate technique, and it's very hard to get something that is really good, especially if you have a label that would go all the way around this object. Okay, with this type of object, what I wanted to highlight is that it's much better to select the object, go into the template library and add a shrink wrap. And I can make it very, very simple. I need a vertical shrink wrap. I want it to be only on the orange part, and I want it to be a little bit offset from here. So I can move that up a bit, and then I'm going to move this down quite a bit. So that's about what I want. And then the important part is that you select the right material. There are 3 default materials in here, a horizontal one and then 2 vertical ones. I'm just going to select the default vertical shrink. Then if I do start simulation, you'll see that it very nicely and quickly shrinks around my cup here. And then when I say add model to scene, I end up with a shrink wrap that covers the complete cup. And that means that if I now select a shrink wrap and I say open in Illustrator, I would get in Illustrator the ability to add artwork. So the artwork that normally would go on the label, I could now add in Illustrator. And I can make the shrink itself invisible by modifying the material that was used for that. So shrink just uses a material as well, which means I can make something that is completely, let me show you by simply adding something else. So I could make a material that is completely invisible, then my shrink disappears and the only thing you're going to see is the artwork. And because in Illustrator you can then also undistort the artwork, I can really place something on this type of object that will look perfect. Okay. That was very short, but it is, like I said, something that gets asked quite a lot. Okay, and that leaves me with the last item on my list, which is the +1 or the one more thing, actually. It's also the most fun part of this presentation, of course, because it's something new. Now, what we heard from people when we showed them iC3D Suite, either because they asked or because we looked at how they did things, is that creating an iC3D model is in many cases only the first step of what you have to do. And the first problem that I describe here is that in many cases, you want to create a model, and then for each model that you create, you have to go through a number of steps, and these steps always come back. You have to develop the model, and then you have to take pictures and a number of specific camera positions for the customer. You might want to export the Collada files, you might want to export 3D PDF, and so on and so on. So after creating the iC3D file, there are a bunch of manual things that you have to do, and of course, those take time, and because it's 3D, it also takes some computer time to generate all of this stuff. The second problem is similar, but with a twist. What we see is that in many cases, people work on series of designs, meaning that you develop an iC3D model, for example, that jam jar that I had, which is strawberry jam. But once you've developed the strawberry jam model and you've taken some time in developing the actual glass container and the lid to go on there and the artwork and so on. But once you've done that, you realize that not only do you have strawberry jam, but you also have, I don't know, orange jam and maybe kumquat jam, who knows. You have 10, 15 other flavors that you have to develop. And for each of those, it is relatively simple, but you have to copy the iC3D file, you have to open it up, open the artwork in Illustrator, replace it with the new artwork, probably also have to adjust the textures that are used to represent the jam in that. So for each of those objects in that series, each of those flavors, you have to go through a number of those manual steps, and then probably you fall back on the first problem, because for each of those flavors, you now have to save images and so on and so on. Very tedious and time-consuming thing to do. So Creative Edge came up with a solution, and the solution is a variant on the iC3D Suite technology. It's called iC3D Automate. It's not available yet. It is actually in beta at the moment, so this is a preview. You're the first ones outside of Creative Edge almost that gets to see this. But the application is called iC3D Suite Automate. It will be released relatively shortly. A press release about that will be issued in the coming weeks. And the goal of the application, as the name implies, will be to automate a number of these manual tasks that you would otherwise have to do within iC3D Suite. So it is a new product. It's a companion product to iC3D Suite. If you don't have iC3D Suite, there's really no point in having the automated version, because you always start from a iC3D Suite file. That's always the input. So you need to have created something in iC3D Suite to get started with this. But then iC3D Automate is a command line application that takes that iC3D Suite file, and that will output either a modified iC3D Suite file, so one with new artwork on it and new textures on it, for example, and or high-res images, Collada files, 3D PDF files, basically anything that iC3D Suite can export. And how that happens is done with flexible actions. Like I said, the application is still in beta, but I did want to give you a little bit of a demonstration. Now, I cannot demonstrate the application itself. Why? Because we're talking about what I said here, we're talking about a command line application. There is nothing to see, it's a command line. I could use terminal, but like I said, it can easily be integrated in other applications. And what I've done, because I happen to be working on that for a beta project already, what I've done is I've actually used switch as automation solution, and I've created a script inside of switch, and that script drives iC3D automate, and it allows me to specify the commands that I want. And this looks very, very complicated, but it's really not. The command is camera, and that sets a camera position. The same way you would in iC3D Suite go into the camera positions here and set the camera position here. So in the same settings that I can use in iC3D Suite, I can now use in this camera action inside of switch. And then after I've set the camera, I give it the action to export a JPEG file. And then the parameters that you see here are the dimensions, DPI, and some other stuff. Then I change the camera position and I ask for another export. And I change the camera position again and I ask for another export. So this is the kind of stuff you can do. You can issue a series of commands to this automated application. And what I can do now, and I will quit iC3D Suite here because we don't need that, it actually does not use the iC3D Suite application itself. It really uses a separate iC3D Automate application. And I was actually looking for an example. I'll take the kumquat. So if I grab this kumquat, I don't think hold on. I need to do this properly, of course. This is switch, so I have to activate the flow so that it starts working. And now I can go back, grab my kumquat file and drag it into the automate input folder here. You can see the little one appear that says that the file is there. And this takes a few seconds because iC3D Automate is now opening that file and is generating output. And in this case, I've created a script that outputs the original file. So if I open this folder here, the output folder, it creates in there the original file with the suffix original. But of course, all of that is configurable in switch. The important part is that iC3D Automate was used, and I can now open all of these with preview, for example. And what you can see is that it exported 3 different JPEGs for me, and each of those JPEGs is the same object that I dragged on there that is inside of that iC3 file, but with a different camera position. And like I said, the actions are very flexible. In this case, I only exported the JPEG files, but I could go in here and say, oh no, I changed my mind. The customer does not only want the JPEG files, but they also want PNG. Well, I could add another action that says render PNG with the same resolution parameters and so on. And if I save that, it will now export 4 files for me, 3 JPEG files and 1 PNG file. So it's very, very flexible. And that flexibility and the fact that it is built on a command line interface will allow it to be integrated into an automation system like this, into a DAM system, into a packaging management system, into anything where you want to do that. Or you could simply use scripting on an internal website or on a solution like that to build an automated workflow with that. So that's a little teaser of an application that is coming. You can expect a press release in the next week or something like that. And the application should be available relatively soon. If you're interested, don't hesitate to ask questions, and we'll be more than happy to come back on that. If there are any questions, then now would be a really good time to enter them in the GoToWebinar control panel. If not, let me just summarize what we talked about here. The main part of this webinar was about the lighting environments, environment maps and lighting maps in iC3D Suite. And please remember the trick of pressing the S key on the keyboard and then using your mouse to rotate the lighting environment without rotating the object. That's perhaps the most important technique in there. Then next to that, we talked about, I already have to think, we talked about labels. And then let me go back for a second. So we talked about lighting, we talked about advanced materials and the material editor, of course, the kumquat, and then we talked about adding labels to non-trivial objects. And then we concluded this one with a very, very short teaser introduction of an application that will be called iC3D Automate, and that you can use in a workflow to, once you've done some manual work in iC3D Suite, do all the rest of the repetitive work that you want to do in a fully automated fashion. And I believe in many workflows that will be a very important addition. Okay, I can see no additional questions at this point, which is very good. I can also see that it's 5 o'clock, so I kept to my timing exactly, which is surprising and impressive. But ideal as well. This was the 5th webinar in this series. There is another one next week that is about a totally different topic. Talks about an imposition solution, IMP, that can be used both in traditional workflows, so commercial workflows if you want, but that has equally powerful applications in label and packaging workflows because it can do step and repeat and everything else that you would want to do in workflows like that. So a totally different subject, but should also be very interesting. As always, the webinar is on Wednesday, starts at 4 p.m. CET, Belgian time, that is, Central European time to be totally exact. I hope to see many of you there again, and thank you for joining yet another summer school webinar, and let me end by wishing you a very good rest of the day. Goodbye.